Off the southern coast of Ireland, 300 feet beneath the Atlantic, lies the wreck of the RMS Lusitania. In May 1915, she was struck by a single German torpedo and sank in just 18 minutes. 1,198 passengers and crew perished, including 128 Americans. The tragedy helped drag the United States into the First World War. For over a century, the official story has remained unchanged. An innocent passenger liner, a barbaric act of war. Case closed. But the wreck tells a different story. Now, for the first time, AI-assisted drones have mapped the Lusitania with unprecedented precision, scanning debris fields and penetrating sections of the hull that have never been documented. What they found was not just rust and wreckage, it was evidence of a second explosion, one that came from inside the ship. Evidence that the British government spent decades trying to destroy. Here is what no one can explain. The Titanic struck an iceberg and took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. The Lusitania took a single torpedo and vanished in 18 minutes. How does a ship larger than the Titanic sink 4 times faster from a smaller wound? The answers may finally be emerging from the darkness below. When the RMS Lusitania slid into the waters of the River Clyde in 1906, she was not just another ocean liner, she was a statement. At 787 feet long and nearly 32,000 tons, she was the largest passenger vessel the world had ever seen. Her 4 massive steam turbines could push her through the Atlantic at 25 knots, faster than any warship afloat. The British press called her the Greyhound of the Seas. To the rest of the world, she was simply untouchable. The Lusitania was the crown jewel of the Cunard Line, but her construction carried a secret. The British Admiralty had quietly funded a portion of her building costs. In exchange, Cunard agreed that the ship could be requisitioned as an armed auxiliary cruiser in times of war. Her hull was reinforced. Her decks were designed to accommodate gun mounts. From the very beginning, the Lusitania was built to serve 2 masters. But in peacetime, she served only one purpose: luxury. Her interiors were designed to rival the finest hotels in Europe. Elevators carried passengers between decks. Electric lights illuminated grand dining saloons paneled in mahogany and walnut. A domed ceiling rose 2 stories above the first-class lounge. There were libraries, smoking rooms, a veranda cafe with wicker furniture and potted palms. For those who could afford the finest cabins, crossing the Atlantic felt less like a voyage and more like a floating vacation. The wealthy and the powerful booked their passages months in advance. Businessmen, aristocrats, diplomats, and celebrities all walked her decks. To sail on the Lusitania was to announce that you had arrived in the world. She was speed, elegance, and British engineering superiority wrapped into one magnificent package. And she delivered. In 1907, the Lusitania captured the Blue Riband for the fastest Atlantic crossing, making the journey from Queenstown to New York in just 4 days and 19 hours. She held that record for years, and even after newer ships challenged her, she remained the standard by which all others were judged. By 1915, the Lusitania had completed over 200 transatlantic crossings without serious incident. Her captain, William Thomas Turner, was a veteran mariner with more than 30 years at sea. He was known for his steady judgment and quiet competence. Cunard trusted him with their flagship, and passengers trusted him with their lives. To those who sailed aboard her, the Lusitania seemed invincible. She was too fast to be caught, too grand to be threatened, too celebrated to ever come to harm. Families posed for photographs on her decks. Children waved from her railings as she pulled away from port. The ship had become more than transportation. She had become a symbol of certainty in an uncertain age. No one standing on her decks in the spring of 1915 could have imagined that within days, that certainty would shatter forever. By May of 1915, the world the Lusitania was built for had ceased to exist. Europe was at war. The Western Front stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border, a scar of trenches and barbed wire where thousands died for yards of mud. And beneath the waves of the Atlantic, a new kind of warfare was taking shape. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes around the British Isles. These submarines were slow, fragile, and limited in range, but they carried torpedoes capable of sinking any vessel afloat. In February, Germany had declared the waters around Britain a war zone. Any ship flying an Allied flag was considered a legitimate target. Neutral vessels were warned to stay away. The threat was not theoretical. Dozens of merchant ships had already been sunk. Sailors had drowned in freezing waters within sight of the Irish coast. The old rules of naval engagement, where attackers surfaced and allowed crews to evacuate, were dissolving. Submarines could not afford such courtesies. They struck from below without warning and vanished before help could arrive. On May 1st, 1915, the Lusitania prepared to depart New York for Liverpool. That same morning, the German embassy took out advertisements in American newspapers. The notice was blunt. travelers were reminded that a state of war existed between Germany and Britain. Vessels flying the British flag were liable to destruction. Passengers sailing into the war zone did so at their own risk. Some passengers canceled their bookings. Most did not. The Lusitania was simply too fast, they reasoned. No submarine could catch her at full speed. She had outrun danger before, and she would do so again. Besides, surely the British Navy would provide an escort as she approached the Irish coast. The Admiralty would never allow their most famous liner to sail unprotected into hostile waters. At noon, the Lusitania pulled away from Pier 54 with 1,959 passengers and crew aboard. Her cargo holds were loaded with what the manifest described as general goods: cheese, furs, copper, machinery, and other commercial items bound for British markets. But there were also items that raised questions. Cases labeled as small arms cartridges, containers of aluminum powder, cargo that did not belong on a passenger liner sailing through a war zone. As the New York skyline faded behind her, the Lusitania steamed east into the Atlantic. Somewhere ahead, invisible beneath the gray waters off the coast of Ireland, the German submarine U-20 was hunting. The passengers dined, strolled the decks, and enjoyed the spring weather. Most had dismissed the German warning as propaganda, a scare tactic meant to intimidate. They had faith in the ship, faith in the captain, and faith in the Navy that would surely protect them. That faith would cost most of them their lives. May 7th, 1915. The Lusitania was just 11 miles off the old head of Kinsale, so close to the Irish coast that passengers could see the green hills rising from the sea. The voyage was nearly over. By the following morning, they would be in Liverpool. Some passengers were finishing lunch. Others had gathered on deck to watch the coastline pass. The mood was calm, almost festive. They had crossed the war zone without incident. The danger, it seemed, had passed. It had not. At 1:20 in the afternoon, Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger of the German submarine U-20 spotted a forest of masts on the horizon. Through his periscope, he watched a massive four-funneled liner steaming directly toward him. He could not believe his luck. The target was not zigzagging. She was not traveling at full speed. She was following a steady, predictable course, as if the war did not exist. Schwieger ordered his crew to prepare a torpedo. At 2:10 in the afternoon, he gave the command to fire. The torpedo struck the Lusitania on the starboard side, just behind the bridge. Passengers heard a dull thud, felt the deck shudder beneath their feet. A column of water and debris erupted from the hull. For a moment there was confusion, but not panic. Torpedoes were survivable. Ships had taken hits before and limped to port. Surely the Lusitania, the grandest liner afloat, could withstand a single blow. Then came the second explosion. This one was different. It came from deep inside the ship, a thunderous roar that shook the entire vessel. Smoke and steam poured from the forward deck. The lights went out. The ship lurched violently to starboard and began to sink by the bow. Within seconds, the Lusitania had taken on a 15-degree list. Half the lifeboats were now useless, hanging too far inboard to be launched. Chaos erupted. Passengers scrambled for the deck, clawing past overturned furniture and broken glass. Crew members struggled to release lifeboats that jammed in their davits or swung wildly as the ship tilted. Some boats launched successfully. Others capsized the moment they touched the water, spilling passengers into the freezing Atlantic. One lifeboat was lowered while still half filled with people and crashed into the sea, killing everyone aboard. Captain Turner ordered the ship turn toward shore, hoping to beach her in the shallows. But the Lusitania was already dying. Her bow was sinking fast, dragging the stern upward. The propellers rose out of the water, still spinning. People slid down the listing deck and fell into the sea. Others jumped, choosing the cold over the crush. 18 minutes after the torpedo struck, the Lusitania was gone. She slipped beneath the surface stern first, her bow pointing toward the sky before plunging into the depths. Behind her, she left a field of wreckage, bodies, and screaming survivors clinging to debris. Fishing boats from Kinsale raced to help. But for most, rescue came too late. Of the 1,959 passengers and crew aboard, 1,198 perished. Among the dead were 128 American citizens, including the millionaire Alfred Vanderbilt, who had given his life jacket to a young mother and her child. Bodies washed up on the Irish coast for weeks. Some were never found. The world recoiled in horror. Britain called it murder. America called it barbarism. Germany called it justice. And no one could explain why a ship that size had sunk so fast. The Lusitania had barely settled on the seafloor before the battle over her legacy began. For over a century, governments, historians, and conspiracy theorists have fought to control the story of what really happened on May 7, 1915. Official reports have been issued and challenged. Documents have been classified and conveniently lost. and the wreck itself has been bombed, hit with depth charges, and declared off limits. The question is simple: why would anyone work so hard to bury the truth about a ship that was already buried? The British government moved quickly to shape the narrative. Within days of the sinking, officials declared the Lusitania an innocent passenger liner, a victim of German barbarism and nothing more. The cargo manifest showed cheese, furs, copper wire, and machinery. There were no weapons aboard, no munitions, no military supplies. She was a civilian vessel, and her passengers were murdered without cause. This version served British interests perfectly. The sinking generated outrage across the United States and shifted American public opinion against Germany. Newspapers printed drawings of drowning women and children. Preachers called for vengeance from their pulpits. Though it would take 2 more years and other provocations, the Lusitania became a symbol that helped push America into the war. Germany told a different story. Berlin insisted the Lusitania was carrying war materials and was therefore a legitimate military target. The ship had been built with Admiralty funds and was registered as an auxiliary cruiser. Her cargo holds contained ammunition destined for British troops. The passengers were unfortunate, but they had been warned. The German embassy had published advertisements in American newspapers the very morning she sailed. Anyone who boarded did so at their own risk. For decades, this remained a propaganda battle, each side dismissing the other's claims. But as the years passed, cracks appeared in the British story. Divers who visited the wreck reported strange damage, holes that seemed inconsistent with a single torpedo strike. Survivors had testified to 2 distinct explosions, the torpedo hit followed by something far larger from within the ship. When pressed, the British Admiralty admitted that yes, the Lusitania had been carrying small arms cartridges, nearly 4.2 million rounds of rifle ammunition. They insisted this was not explosive cargo and could not have caused the second blast. But then came the strangest detail of all. In the 1950s and the 1960s, the Royal Navy conducted a series of depth charge attacks on the Lusitania wreck. The official explanation was that the ship posed a hazard to navigation and needed to be flattened. But the wreck lay in 300 feet of water, far below any shipping lane. She was no danger to anyone, unless she was a danger to the official story. Researchers later discovered that the depth charges had been specifically targeted at the BOW section, precisely where the second explosion had occurred, and precisely where any remaining evidence of contraband cargo would have been stored. Documents that might have explained the Admiralty's decisions were classified. Key files went missing. Survivors who contradicted the official account were ignored. The wreck was declared a protected site, and salvage operations were restricted. For 100 years, the Lusitania kept her secrets. But secrets do not stay buried forever, not when the technology exists to find them. For decades, the Lusitania remained beyond reach. She lay 300 feet below the surface off the Irish coast, deep enough to kill any diver who stayed too long, and shallow enough to tantalize anyone who wanted to uncover her secrets. Salvage teams made occasional visits. Researchers gathered what footage they could with the limited technology of their era. But the wreck was deteriorating, collapsing under its own weight, and the full truth seemed destined to vanish along with it. Then the technology caught up. In recent years, a series of expeditions equipped with AI-assisted remotely operated vehicles, known as ROV, descended to the Lusitania with capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction a generation ago. These were not the crude submersibles of the 1980s and the 1990s. These machines carried high-definition cameras, multi-beam sonar arrays, and photogrammetry systems capable of building 3-dimensional models accurate to the millimeter. Onboard processors powered by artificial intelligence could identify structural patterns, flag anomalies, and map debris fields with surgical precision. For the first time, the Lusitania could be studied not as a shadow on a sonar screen, but as a complete digital reconstruction, every rivet and fracture preserved in data. The descent began in calm water on a gray morning. The ROV slipped beneath the surface and dropped through layers of green light that faded to black. Sediment swirled in the floodlights. Shapes emerged from the darkness. Indistinct at first, then sharpening into something recognizable, the hull of the Lusitania rose from the seafloor like a fallen cathedral. She lies on her starboard side, the same side where the torpedo struck over a century ago. The weight of years has crushed her superstructure. Decks have collapsed into one another. The funnels that once made her silhouette famous are gone, broken away and scattered across the sand. Fishing nets drape her hull like burial shrouds, tangled in the wreckage by decades of trawlers passing overhead. But it was the damage that silenced the control room. Holes gaped in the hull where no torpedo could have struck. Jagged wounds torn through the bow section, edges bent outward as if something inside had exploded with tremendous force. These were not the marks of a German submarine. These were the scars left by British depth charges, dropped on purpose, decades after the sinking. The cameras pushed deeper, gliding along corridors filled with silt, past portholes clouded with growth, into compartments that had not been seen since the ship went down. Personal effects littered the debris field. Shoes, luggage, ceramic tiles from the grand dining saloon. Each object a fragment of a life interrupted. And then the ROV reached the forward cargo holds, where the second explosion had originated and where the Royal Navy had tried so hard to destroy. What the cameras revealed there would change everything historians thought they knew. The original purpose of the expedition was documentation. Researchers wanted to map the deteriorating wreck before it collapsed entirely, to create a digital record that would survive even if the physical remains did not. But what began as an act of preservation became something far more explosive, because the closer the cameras looked, the clearer the evidence became. This was not just a ship killed by a torpedo. This was a ship torn apart from within. The first discovery confirmed what everyone already suspected. The torpedo damage was exactly where Captain Lieutenant Schwieger reported it, starboard side, just aft of the bow. The hole was large, consistent with the standard G6 torpedo carried by German U-boats at the time. Significant damage, certainly, but naval engineers reviewing the footage reached a troubling conclusion. A single torpedo strike of that size should not have been fatal. Ships had survived worse. The Lusitania should have stayed afloat long enough for rescue. She should not have sunk in 18 minutes, which made the second discovery all the more damning. The bow section of the wreck showed catastrophic damage that could not be explained by the torpedo alone. Steel plates had been blown outward, bent and twisted by a force that originated inside the hull. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who understood explosives. This was not the result of coal dust igniting. This was not a boiler rupturing. This was a detonation, sudden and massive, tearing through the forward cargo holds with enough power to break the ship's back. AI analysis of the debris field added further detail. Fragments of the hull were scattered in patterns consistent with an internal explosion of significant yield. Sonar mapping revealed that the structural failure began in the cargo area, not at the point of torpedo impact. Whatever killed the Lusitania, the torpedo was only the trigger. The real destruction came from something she was already carrying. Samples recovered from the wreck site over the years had detected traces of aluminum powder, a key component in munitions manufacturing. The cargo manifest admitted to 4.2 million rounds of rifle ammunition, a fact the British government denied for decades before quietly acknowledging it was true. But rifle cartridges do not explode with the force necessary to sink an ocean liner in 18 minutes. Something else was in that hold. Artillery shells, gun cotton, explosive compounds hidden beneath innocent labels. Contraband, in other words, hidden beneath the paperwork. The final discovery was perhaps the most chilling of all. The depth charge damage inflicted by the Royal Navy in the 1950s and 1960s was concentrated almost entirely on the BOW section. The very compartments where the second explosion originated, the very area where evidence of contraband cargo would have been stored. This was not an effort to flatten a navigation hazard. This was an effort to destroy proof. The scans painted a picture that no official report had ever admitted. The Lusitania was carrying materials that turned her into a floating bomb. The torpedo provided the spark. The cargo provided the fuel, and for 100 years, the institutions responsible for her voyage worked to ensure no one would ever know the truth. When footage and analysis from the Lusitania expeditions were first presented to maritime historians and naval engineers, the reaction was not satisfaction at solving a century-old mystery. It was something closer to horror. The wreck offered evidence that changed the frame of the whole story. The implications reached far beyond one ship and one torpedo. They reached into the foundations of how the First World War began and who bears responsibility for the 1,198 people who died off the coast of Ireland. The first implication is the hardest to accept. If the Lusitania was carrying explosive munitions, then the passengers aboard her were human shields. They were not simply travelers who happened to be in the wrong place. They were cover, a civilian screen placed between contraband cargo and the German U-boats hunting for it. The British government knew U-boats were prowling the Irish Sea, and they knew the Lusitania was a target. They let her sail anyway, loaded with materials that would ensure her destruction if she was ever hit. This means that 1,198 men, women, and children did not die because of German barbarism alone. They died because their own side placed them in the line of fire to protect a weapons shipment. For 100 years, their families were told a different story. The second implication concerns the cover-up itself. Governments lose documents, bureaucracies misplace files. These things happen through negligence and time. But depth charging your own shipwreck is not negligence, it is deliberate destruction of evidence. The Royal Navy targeted the bow section of the Lusitania, the exact location where proof of contraband cargo would have rested. They did this decades after the sinking, long after any military justification could apply. The only rational explanation is that someone in a position of authority wanted the evidence gone. This was not a passive cover-up. This was active, sustained, and methodical. The third implication is perhaps the most consequential. The sinking of the Lusitania helped turn American public opinion against Germany and contributed to the United States entering the First World War. The narrative was simple and powerful. An innocent passenger liner, unarmed civilians, murdered without warning by a ruthless enemy. That story moved a nation toward war. But if the Lusitania was carrying munitions, the narrative collapses. She was not innocent. She was a legitimate military target by the rules of war that existed at the time. Germany had warned passengers. Germany had published advertisements. And Germany was right. Would America have entered the war if the public had known the truth? Would 116,000 American soldiers have died in the trenches of France? History does not allow for clean answers, but the questions are unavoidable. And the final implication is the most frustrating of all. The wreck is collapsing. The depth charges destroyed critical sections. The sea is slowly consuming what remains. Some secrets went down with the Lusitania in 1915. Others were blown apart by the Royal Navy decades later. We may never recover them. The AI scans of the Lusitania have answered questions that lingered for over a century. We now know that the second explosion was real, that it came from inside the ship, and that the British government worked actively to conceal the evidence. But answers, it turns out, only lead to deeper questions, and the deepest of them may never be resolved. Did the Admiralty deliberately sacrifice the Lusitania? Winston Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty in May of 1915. He wrote in private correspondence that it would be useful if neutral shipping were attacked, because it could draw the United States into the conflict. The Lusitania received warnings about U-boat activity, but was provided no escort. Captain Turner was ordered to follow a course that took him directly through waters where submarines had been spotted days before. Coincidence is possible. Conspiracy is also possible. The documents that might settle the question have never been fully released. What else was in that cargo hold? The manifest listed rifle cartridges, aluminum powder, and other materials. But rifle cartridges do not detonate with enough force to sink an ocean liner in 18 minutes. Something more powerful was hidden in those forward compartments. Artillery shells, gun cotton, high explosives disguised under false labels. The full inventory may have been destroyed along with the evidence. How many other ships carried similar cargo? The Lusitania was not the only passenger liner crossing the Atlantic during the war. If Cunard and the Admiralty were willing to use civilians as cover once, they were willing to do it again. How many other voyages carried hidden weapons beneath the feet of unknowing passengers? How many close calls were there that history never recorded? And beneath all of these questions lies the human weight of the tragedy. 1,198 names. 1,198 lives ended in 18 minutes of terror. Families who watched from the shore and never saw their loved ones return. Survivors who carried the screams and the cold and the chaos with them for the rest of their lives. Children who grew up without parents. Parents who buried children. The Lusitania is a grave, but it is also evidence, and the tension between those two truths may never be resolved. Do we owe the dead a full excavation of the wreck, a final accounting of what was done to them and why? Or do we owe them peace, a silence to match the silence of the sea? The ship has given up many of her secrets, but the institutions that sent her into danger have not. And perhaps that is the most haunting revelation of all. The Lusitania did not just sink. She was silenced, first by the sea, then by the people who sent her there. If this story left you with questions, share your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video if you want more investigations where history and technology collide. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a discovery. The next mystery is waiting.